we will try to do it this way that each speaker will give about a 15-minute talk, and we'll have a few questions after each of the talk, and then we'll see if we have more time at the end. So, without further ado, I think I will introduce Þóra Ellen, who actually, like Árni said, is not here today. Þóra Ellen is a professor of botany at the University of Iceland and has done some extensive research up in the Central Highland, in particular in the Þjórsárver area, which this photo actually comes from. That's mainly research on plant ecology, because she's also been, in the recent years, involved in making a classification system for landscapes in Iceland with her colleagues. And Þóra has also been quite involved in policy making as an expert. And for example, she was on a team that was preparing for the revision of the new Icelandic Conservation Act a few years back, and has actually served on the board of the master plan for geothermal and hydropower utilization and protection since the beginning of that process some 15 years ago. So it would have been a pleasure to introduce you to Þóra, but instead we have Caitlin Wilson, who is a colleague of mine and leads the EcoSchool project at Landvernd and is a PhD student at the University of Iceland studying environmental education. So now you have your 15 minutes of being a professor, so go ahead.
Thank you.
Þóra Ellen was actually my teacher, so I can do a good impression. The Central Highland of Iceland, a global perspective. Iceland is among the world's largest oceanic islands, with an area of 100,000 square kilometers. Almost all farms and villages lie below 200 meters above sea level, but such land only accounts for about a quarter of Iceland's area. Inhabited areas are mostly a narrow strip around the coast and into glaciated valleys, with broader plains in the west and particularly south. Over half of Iceland is an interior highland. The plateau itself is mostly 400 to 700 meters above sea level, but above it rise active and extinct volcanoes and several large ice caps. The surface of the plain is sometimes flat, sometimes undulating. Much of the interior is desert-like, covered with moraines, sand and gravel, lava and tephra, and often extremely barren, with a plant cover of less than 5%. Most of the Icelandic highland has never been inhabited and never sustained permanent farms. This sets it apart from most remaining wilderness areas in Europe, that is, those of Scandinavia, where the Sami have lived. The highland of Iceland is small compared to the great wildernesses of the earth. It has no endemic species, no large native mammals. It is relatively species poor, and most areas have low biodiversity. Like so many oceanic islands, Iceland underwent massive environmental transformation following human settlement in the 9th century AD. The barren parts of the plain may in places be regarded as at least partly anthropogenic deserts. Others are natural deserts, and some ecosystems on the highland are probably little influenced by man. In spite of its often harsh appearance and inhospitable environment, the Central Highland has ecosystems and areas of great biological value. Some ecosystems are globally rare. Some places have been very little influenced by man, and others are of international importance for birds, particularly geese. The ecosystems associated with the freshwater springs may not have counterparts anywhere else. Let us first turn to rare ecosystems. Riparian meadows. Riparian meadows, or riparian wetlands, develop where large rivers meander on flat plains. They are sustained by running water, seasonal floods, and sediment deposition. They provide important ecosystem services and are usually fertile and highly productive. Riparian wetlands are found in many parts of the world, usually close to river mouths, and some are among the world's most densely populated areas. for example in Bangladesh by the great rivers Ganges and Brahmaputra. In Iceland, riparian meadows are best developed along glacial rivers on the lowlands close to the coast, as is the case elsewhere. However, there are also found in 3 areas in the Central Highland close to the river origins at the glacier: Hvítárvatn, east of Langjökull, Þjórsárver, south of Hofsjökull, and Eyjavakkar, north of Vatnajökull. Perhaps they are the sole examples of sedge-dominated meadows developing in front of glaciers. They have distinctive vegetation and support rich bird life. They also have a high scenic value. Green and productive plains contrast with white glacier and milky glacial rivers. Lichen-dominated lavas. Holocene lavas, that is, lavas less than 10,000 years old, cover about 1/10 of Iceland. Their vegetation shows pronounced regional differences. In South Iceland, with its high precipitation and mild climate, a single moss species, Raccometrium lanuginosum, becomes dominant, forming thick carpets. In the much drier northeast, it is a very minor part of the vegetation. Inland and at altitudes above about 450 to 500 meters, the fruticose lichen Stereocolon vesuvianum is often dominant or co-dominant with Raccometrium mosses. Such lichen-covered lavas are known outside of Iceland, for example on Lanzarote of the Canary Islands and on Italy, as the Latin name of the species Vesuvianum reflects. Globally, such lichen-dominated lavas are rare, and the Icelandic Institute of Natural History has rated their conservation value as very high. Permafrost and pulsas. Permafrost is defined as ground that has remained frozen for at least 2 years, but most of the Earth's permafrost is much older than that. Frozen water need not be present, and high alpine permafrost, that is, in high mountains, may mostly be in solid rock. However, most of the Earth's permafrost contains water and is often very ice-rich. Permafrost has been established in high mountains in Iceland, but its most prominent expression is in wetlands on the Central Highland Plain. Pulsas are large hummocks that rise out of wetland as a frozen core grows inside them. In Iceland, pulsas are usually 1 to 1.5 meters in height, but range in length from a few meters to many dozens of meters. The largest may be almost 100 meters in length. Þjórsárver Nature Reserve in central Iceland has the greatest concentration of pulsas. There, the frozen core may be 1.5 to 3.5 meters in thickness at the end of summer. Some pulsas are frozen right down to the moraine underneath, but in Þjórsárver, most probably float on a water-saturated layer of organic soils and fine-grained sediments. There is only a slight transfer of solid materials involved in pulsar growth. They rise above the wetland or shallow pond simply because frozen water has a lower specific gravity than liquid water, and the growth of the frozen core elevates it above the surroundings. If the frozen core melts, the pulsa collapses, leaving a depression or a shallow pond. The original wetland vegetation, adapted to a high water table and secure snow cover during winter, mostly dies. In time, other plants colonize, species tolerant of the dry and more extreme conditions on the top of the pulsa. Pulsas therefore create a mosaic in the landscape, with hummocks alternating with wetlands and ponds, harboring relatively high biodiversity. Pulsas are also important as nesting sites, for example, for pink-footed geese. In Iceland, the lower elevation limits of pulsas are set by climate and lie between 550 and 600 meters. The upper elevation, at about 700 meters, arises because, higher up, there is continuous wetland vegetation. Pulsas are characteristic of permafrost close to its climatic limits. That is, they are mostly, though not exclusively, found close to the southern limits of permafrost in Canada, Finland, and Siberia. Pulsas are globally rare, and they are listed by the Berne Convention as endangered habitats in Europe. Most of the Icelandic pulsas are probably close to their climatic limits, and it is likely that many will disappear that is, melt in the next few decades. Thermophilic bacteria. In Iceland, there are about 20 high-temperature areas, all on the active volcanic zone, and most are on the Central Highland. These extreme areas are inhabited by specialized microbes, some of which can tolerate temperatures of over 100 degrees centigrade. From recent surveys of many of the major areas, a large number of previously unknown taxa were discovered, and it has become apparent that there are marked differences between fields, possibly reflecting high endemicity. These high-temperature ecosystems are globally rare. They have high scientific value, and some of these microbes may have useful properties for various applications. Pristine vegetation. Most of Iceland is marked by centuries of sheep grazing. Only a few areas were so remote or so inaccessible that they remained naturally protected from livestock grazing. In the Central Highland, such areas include Vonarskarð, Nýidalur, Fagrahlíð, and Þjórsárver. The last have at least been lightly grazed. Even though they lie at high altitudes, Þjórsárver at about 600 meters, Fagrahlíð about 700, and Vonarskarð upwards from about 950 meters, the vegetation is strikingly different and much lusher. The dominant plant species may be tall, broad-leaved herbs like angelica and roseroot, both highly palatable and soon disappear with grazing pressure. Clearly, the conservation and scientific value of these areas is high. They are also very scenic. Typically, flowering is profuse, and they are very colorful in midsummer. In addition to these well-vegetated areas, there are also extensive natural deserts. This applies to the land north of Vatnajökull that is inaccessible to sheep, and Tungnar á Öræfi and Veiðivötn west of Vatnajökull. Fragments of previous vegetation. At least some areas that are now desert-like looked quite different before settlement. This conclusion is supported by historical evidence, place names, remaining fragments of vegetation or organic soils, and eroding land revealing coal pits that show that the land was not only vegetated, but supported birch forest with trees large enough for coal making. It was primarily the mesic and dry vegetation that disappeared. The wetlands were more resilient. In places, there were extensive heaths with tall willows or dwarf shrubs, and even occasionally birch woodland. The willow heaths of Þjórsárver can be regarded as the sole remaining mesic vegetation in an otherwise very barren part of the Central Highland. Other fragments include Karlsbrattur, east of Langjökull, with its extremely isolated birch forest, Bæjarlönd by the river Jökulsá á Fjöllum, and the diverse heathland that was partly submerged by the reservoir of Kárahnjúkar power plant. The organic soils of these areas open possibilities to reconstruct their environmental and vegetation history. Further, these fragments have a much higher biodiversity than the barrens and constitute seed pools that may be important for natural vegetation, revegetation of the adjacent barrens. Cold springs and oases. Iceland is exceptionally rich in cold water springs. Unfortunately, they have been a neglected field of research, and a comprehensive evaluation of their global significance still remains. Still, a superficial survey indicates that perhaps 8 of the world's 10 greatest spring areas are in Iceland. The largest springs obtain much or nearly all of their water from the Central Highland. Of the 10 largest springs, 6 are either on the Central Highland or at its margin: Þingvallavatn, Brúará, Mývatn, Hraunfossar-Húsfell, Haukadalur, and Svartá við Vaðaldi. These springs have an enormously high value as a resource of clean water. They are also extremely valuable for the often distinctive ecosystems that accompany them and the scenic and attractive landscapes they create. We use the word oasis here for want of a better term. Small islands of green vegetation with cold and clear running water in an otherwise dry and gray desert. The oases vary greatly in size. Some are quite tiny, others may cover several hectares. In protected or lightly grazed areas, there are willows, angelica, geraniums, buttercups, and lady's mantle. When all the areas described earlier are pooled, it becomes clear that the highland plateau does have significant biological value. It must be added that only a part of the natural value has been considered here. Birds have barely been mentioned, nor invertebrates, and geological and visual landscape values have scarcely or only briefly been touched upon. The future of many of these areas appears uncertain. The PALSA areas will probably drastically change over the next few decades. Hydropower plants have been proposed for all the major rivers on the highland, including reservoirs on the plateau itself. Similarly, geothermal development has been proposed for all the accessible major high-temperature areas, that is, outside of glaciers. The use of these sparsely vegetated barrens as summer grazing land for sheep, especially the vulnerable areas on the active volcanic zone, has been debated for decades. This is land that soil scientists have evaluated as unfit for grazing, and biologists maintain that it represents unsustainable and ecologically indefensible land use. The special biological, cultural, and landscape value of the highland is increasingly being recognized, as is reflected in the growing campaign to have all the Central Highland declared a national park. That is the end of Thora Ellen's presentation. If there are any questions now, as you all, those of you who came in late, I am not Thora Ellen, but maybe Mimmi or someone else can answer any of those questions.
Yeah, so if any of you have questions about Thora's talk, we will do our best and maybe get help from the audience as well to answer them. But if you don't have any, that would be fine to us. But go ahead, if anyone wants to. Yeah. There is one over there. Go ahead.
Just a question, are there spiritual values also considered in the research? Spiritual values of the highlands? This is one question, and the second question, you mentioned the high scientific value of certain types of biological features. Are there some reference areas also kind of protected, getting the status of protection as being seen as, or kind of designated for reference areas for research?
Right. I'll try my best to answer these questions. As it goes for protected areas, yes, there are protected areas already in the Central Highland. About 35% of the Central Highland, if I remember these numbers correctly, are already a national park, the Vatnajökull National Park. And then there are several nature reserves scattered around the area. So it's not like we are on square one, but what we believe in this campaign is that putting it all into one national park would give the area a much stronger protection status, would be easier to manage it with terms or in relation with tourism and also other land use. So I think I could definitely answer that. About the spiritual one, maybe there is someone else in the audience who could answer that, but for sure there are studies that have been done on cultural values, and in particular archaeological studies. But if anyone in the audience wants to...
Yeah, I could say that I have studied the aesthetic value, which is very
Yeah.
closely related to the spiritual value of these landscapes, and also Thora Ólafsdóttir's research on tourists and their experience of traveling around this area addresses that.
Yeah, definitely. Studies on tourism, of course, have been increasing a lot in the past few years. All right, I think we need to continue since we started a bit later. Our next speaker is Peter Prokosk, and he is the founder and chairman of an organization called Linking Tourism and Conservation. Peter has actually done quite many amazing things throughout his career. I'm only going to mention a few of them. He was the CEO of WWF in Frankfurt in Germany, and also a developer, I think I can say, and then a CEO of the Arctic program of WWF that was established in the 1990s and located in Norway, in Oslo. And Peter, he is here first and foremost because he has an extensive experience actually in guiding and helping in establishing and developing protected areas, in particular national parks, in the Nordic countries, the Baltic, and I think also in Germany and a little bit in Iceland as well. So Peter, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mumi. And dear participants interested in the Highlands, I thank first of all Landvern and the Icelandic Nature Conservation Organization, which we worked long together with, for giving me the opportunity to present to you my view of the Highlands in Iceland, which is related to the perspectives of my present organization called Linking Tourism and Conservation, but also of my past history of being heavily involved in the circumpolar Arctic. We just had the honor to listen to the General Secretary Ban Ki-moon of the UN, and he was honored for the whole world's achievement of last year, which has been both the incredible agreement on the climate, but from my perspective it's even more important. The climate decision is part of the 17 so-called Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe that this decision, which has been backed by 193 countries in the world, it has been developed for all countries in an equal way. Millions of people of the society, of the civil society, has been involved in it. This is one of the greatest achievements of the world society, to agree on 17 fairly concrete 17 goals and underpinned by 169 sub-goals, which you can measure statistically. So there's no excuse anymore these days that somebody who uses the word sustainable development or want to say that they want to be sustainable, they have to relate to this agreed framework, the Bible of the world. They can relate to any of these and can explain to which of these goals, to which of these sub-goals they want to contribute in a positive way. So I have chosen with my little organization Linking Tourism and Conservation to contribute to the goal number 14 and 15, which is preserving the biodiversity on land and in the oceans. And that relates also to the Convention on Biodiversity. We actually understand each other as a support organization to the CBD, so-called Target 11, which is aiming for a complete and representative network of protected areas. 17% on land, 10% in the oceans. That has been also being a major issue when the world met in Rio +20 in Rio and talked about the future we want, and already there it was mentioned that tourism has potentially a major role to positively support any of these 17 today development goals. Therefore, I have established an organization which tries to profile the best cases in the world where tourism is supporting the establishment or the further development of protected areas. Believing that without tourism we would not have many of these national parks already, because tourism is the major sector of the society interested in those. And also for tourism it has a major economical value. So we are trying to profile those cases, but not only that, we are also seeking to develop incentives that those cases those what we call LTNC examples will be replicated. We have, over the 2.5 years, we have spent the existing gathered 180 members, which we call penguins, all over the world, which are related to tourism or conservation. These are often two different worlds, and it's quite important that you have these two perspectives together and also on different levels. So we're trying also to make our members and those organizations also behind to cooperate or seek to produce synergy. You find on this map, if you go on our website, you find these examples, click on them and see what they are. I myself have been the pleasure to develop the Arctic program of WWF between 1992 and 2002, and later on I was also leading the Norwegian Foundation Grid Arendal, which is kind of the polar center for UNEP. And in this time I have been very much convinced myself that the Arctic should be and can be the first region in the world which reaches, of course, all the environmental goals which the world has agreed more easily than any other region, and should be therefore the region of peace, inspiration and environmental lead. So that's also my personal background, why I also in that time have been already looked at the great value of the Arctic of hosting the world's largest unfragmented wilderness untouched areas. We once mapped, for instance, the 25 largest ones in order to make that really a special value of the Arctic. We dealt with pictures like on the left side is a picture from Yamal. If you look from the plane to these areas, you get a fascinating view on the impressive pictures of untouched nature. But I also took once on the flight from Iceland this middle picture. So you have these pictures here on Iceland. And Iceland is in a Western European context, and you had all the details just in the previous talk, one of the largest wilderness and untouched areas. And it is from that perspective, and also in the context of the whole Arctic, a very special treasure you have here in Iceland, and which needs special attention. And therefore we have been already working together with INCA and supporting INCA in the campaign against destroying these unfragmented wilderness areas in the 90s, when there was planned to build 3 dams cutting off 3 of the major rivers coming from the Vatnajökull glacier, related to the plan to build an aluminium smelter in Reyðarfjörður. We succeeded in the beginning. We had pushed out the Norwegian company Norsk Hydro, and they have given the world also great arguments why they pulled out. They said it is irresponsible for social reasons, also for natural reasons, to build that huge factory into the small fishery commune in Reyðarfjörður. Nevertheless, there came the American company Alcoa and built this, but because of relationships which are not going into more detail with personnel in WFUS and Alcoa in the board, Alcoa made a major attempt to keep that impact as low as possible. So the result of all that was that the Vatnajökull National Park was established with support of Alcoa. They also financed a major environmental fund which is financing lots of education work there. And only one of the rivers have been dammed. So that is a partial success, and on that success and on the belief that the value of the highlands altogether is so high, both organizations, Landvern and INCA, are further on convinced that it would be a good idea to get the entire highlands under national park. So this is the vision they all have. So not only the green area, which is already a national park, but the entire red area is the area which Iceland should protect as a national park. You saw enough pictures of that. I just borrowed here some of Landvern's pictures of Steiner Kato. If you just look at these pictures, you will see already and get a taste of what incredible landscape this is, and you heard in the previous talk how valuable that is. And it is certainly, and we heard today also the figure from the tourism business, that 80% of all tourists coming to Iceland are coming because of the nature. They want to experience the great nature which they have heard from others or want to see. So this gives also a great opportunity, and also referring to some of the words this morning from the three speakers talking on the tourism in Iceland, that leads to the great opportunity that Iceland in particular could follow the view of the UN World Tourism Organization, which says tourism has the potential to have a positive impact on all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So make it happen that you are supporting in particular, apart from of course climate change, and that part I heard very great presentations yesterday, that there is lots of thinking in Iceland to become climate neutral. We have also the commitment under the Paris Agreement for that. The easiest way to reach that would be just to close down the Reyðarfjörður or all aluminium smelters in Iceland. That is probably the easiest and probably also the most economic way. And you could, with tourism, significantly support the SDG number 15, the biodiversity on that. Just ending with the figures you probably all know, you have seen this extremely increase of tourism here in Iceland. It's now the biggest export value factor here in Iceland, and therefore it should be also easy to talk about, to make Iceland the sustainable country in the world, and also in the context that I'm expecting the whole Arctic to be on the forefront of leading the world in terms of being first, reaching all the Sustainable Development Goals. Iceland could make a specific step by using the support of tourism, and therefore I'm very interested whether not already now, before it is finally decided by the Parliament or whoever decides here, that you actually get the whole Highland under National Park. I would like to see also that this can be another LTNC example by documenting that the tourism industry from the very beginning is supporting that idea. And we heard already several important people and organizations mentioning that. The whole organization has its roots in the development in Iceland, and I was happy to hear today the representative in Svalbard, from the Iceland Air, referring to the WWF Arctic Tourism Guidelines, that this would also guide decisions of Iceland Air. These tourism guidelines arose from a similar problem in Svalbard, where the wilderness was going to be fragmented by a road, and a small coalition between tour companies and conservation organizations made it happen. That this did not happen, but Norway declared Svalbard, made it to a state goal to be the best managed wilderness area in the world, created a few new national parks, had an environmental law, and established an environment fund where all the tourists today pay into, and the money is used in a transparent way to manage the wilderness. So that was actually the origin of thinking that tourism can play a major role politically or by ways of finances or education to achieve the world agreed goal to get a complete network of protected areas. And you all can make a major difference in that, whether you are supporting this campaign by being a member in INCAR or Landvern, or raise your voice here as a tour company, or you can even become one of our penguins, as we call our members, and be part of this global discussion how we can reach a complete network of protected areas supported by tourism. Thank you.
Well,
unfortunately don't really have time for a question, so if you have questions for Peter, just please approach him outside afterwards. I'm sorry about that. Our next speaker is already here, which is good, Oliver Luckett. And Oliver is a technology entrepreneur and currently the CEO of Revilopark, which is actually Oliver spelled backwards. Yes, exactly. So there are so many notes that I was given about Oliver, so I think it's actually easier to tell you what he has not done rather than to tell you what he has done. But I have to tell you that he's been very active in the social media in the United States and has run campaigns like or social campaigns like Obama for America and many others. So that's one of the things that this great guy has done. And
I'm just seeing if any of this is true.
yeah, exactly. He's reading it over. I'm a little stressed out right now. But he's actually publishing a book very soon on the 15th of November, I believe. The Social Organism, not Orgasm, sorry.
That's right.
But I almost said that. I was practicing before I came here. But what I really want to But on a more personal note, Oliver,
I think there's nothing more personal.
he just moved to Iceland with his partner Scott, and they have been instrumental in pushing this initiative of National Park in the Highlands, supporting us tremendously, and we're very thankful for that. And Oliver, the floor is yours, and you're already here.
Thank you.
And don't go into details, okay?
So I'm Oliver Luckett. It's nice you all came to see this today. So I'm looking at this from a rather personal perspective. Scott and I started coming to Iceland about 5 years ago. We were just collecting our Iceland Air points recently and realized we had come here 45 times over the last 5 years. Originally we came at the calling of Bjork. We worked with her on a project called Biophilia, which was a very interesting multimedia application that was really kind of the first iApp record album, and learned a lot about technology and nature and culture working through it, but really started falling in love with Iceland. We subsequently, in those 45 visits, got involved with politics here. We got involved with the art scene. We loved it so much that in October, after I sold my last company, The Audience, we decided to permanently relocate here. So yesterday we sold our house in LA, officially, finally, and we bought a house in Seltjarnarnes, and we are now Icelandic residents. Thank you. We learned that we're the 334th and 35th Americans that have ever relocated to Iceland willingly, except for the military. Not that anymore. And Epney, by the way, is a little company that a woman, Heather Kristen, and I have formed here, which is really all about kind of finding the best in Iceland. So, on that note, the Blue Lagoon. So if you look at the brand of Iceland, over the last 5 years, and the reason I show these images, especially of Kim Kardashian, because we want her to be associated with the island as much as possible. She didn't get robbed here, thankfully. But what's interesting is that if you look at the line of social media, if you look at the growth of Instagram, and you look at the growth of tourism in Iceland, they are literally parallel. And Iceland has been discovered by millions of people inside of social media. Everybody yearns for their Blue Lagoon selfie. They all come to Iceland, they all want this image. As a matter of fact, right now there are 550,000 selfies of the Blue Lagoon on Instagram today. There are 3.8 million posts of Iceland on Instagram today. But what's important is that people equate a value system with Iceland that's not just nature, although 86% of tourists that come here equate it with nature. But there's actually a very interesting embodiment of a lot of different things here in Iceland that at least I've discovered. And a lot of Icelanders always look at me and say, what the hell are you doing in Iceland? Why are you here? Why would you leave LA? The weather is so much better there. And I think that the positive aspects of Iceland way outweigh the fact that we have erratic weather. If you look at it, I think the brand of Iceland has 4 very distinct qualities. Number one is this idea, and maybe it's a totally utopian idea, of democracy and humanism, but at every turn that I've seen in this country, we have an unbelievable opportunity here. You almost have a direct democracy. You know, the idea that you can look at someone and say, wow, you're a hypocrite in the Panama Papers, and can peacefully overturn a government within 24 hours of an admission is pretty amazing and remarkable. The idea that you have a creativity-based culture, that beginning with the sagas, you know, on to, you know, modern day performers, we're talking about a real value system here that values artists, that looks up to them, that looks at those kind of ideas of creativity percolating up in the society, and really more than any place I've ever been in my life, really values them. You have an ultra-connected society. I don't know if many of you know this, but Seltjarnarnes was the first city in the world to offer fiber to its residents in 2007. You also have the highest penetration of Facebook and Snapchat, and you have an unbelievably high internet capacity here per citizen. And then last, but of course not least, because that's what this is about nature and sustainability. So let's look at democracy and humanism. How many of you know about the Constitution here in Iceland that was written in wiki style? Do any of you know about that story? No? So I think it was about 5 years ago, after the economic collapse, 1,000 citizens in Iceland were polled. And those citizens were given an opportunity to rewrite the Constitution. That Constitution was then ratified by the people, and now it's stuck in Parliament, but a big effort is underway by myself and Larry Lessig and some other people to unstick that and to really be the world's first constitution that was written in wiki style by the people, for the people. So that's a great example. Another great example is the Best Party. Right? The Best Party is actually the first political party to ever be created inside of social media. Jon Nard created that party as a Facebook group. It's a great, really fun, interesting story about it. And so that party actually went on, as you know, to win the mayoral race and really transform Icelandic politics, I think, to a much more open and inclusive system. It was a very successful tenure. It was the idea of rewriting the energy company relationships, dealing with the banks, et cetera, because Reykjavik being the largest area, or inhabited area. But then you have a long history of peace, of course, the end of the Cold War, and that celebration. And then this idea that I think the rest of the world looks at, you know, when we jail bankers, right? The rest of the world sees this as this great democratic, this great egalitarian moment that we actually, instead of rewarding them with $100 million penthouses in New York, we actually, you know, try to reform them or give them some form of punitive relationship with the citizens. And then, of course, the Peace Tower, which is being lit tomorrow. You know, there are all these elements of Icelandic culture that are interesting to be preserved, which is this idea of peace. You know, we're always number one on the social indexes, always number one when it comes to peace and humanism and egalitarianism. And luckily, we're experiencing a great economy right now, and so that leads to things like very little, if any, homelessness, very little, if any, unemployment, etc. The next thing is, you know, this idea of a creativity-based culture. You know, starting in the 1200s with the sagas, which really laid the foundation for, you know, kind of respecting storytelling here, all the way to modern people like Gabriela Fredriksdottir of New York, or Monsters and Men, or Sigur Rós, or Pleo, or any of these other great musicians. It's unbelievable that a country that has 330,000 people can produce this much concentrated creativity. And it really, I think, stems, and I'm learning more about it, and I think we all are, it really stems from this individualism that exists here, this kind of laxness, referencing the Nobel laureate author, about this individualism and this creativity. But for me, who studies social systems at scale, and who just wrote a book about the idea that social systems start looking like biological systems, this represents great biodiversity in human thought. And so the idea that it can come from almost such a homogeneous place, this amazing biodiversity of thought, is really unique to Iceland. The other thing is this connected society. These are just a bunch of statistics. but a lot of the work that Reykjavik Energy did in leveraging the access to the homes, 88,000 homes in Reykjavik. Every home in Reykjavik has the capacity for 1 gigabit a second fiber to the home. We actually got the first 5 gigabit second fiber connection in Iceland recently at our house in Seltjarnarnes, and it's unbelievable to see the capacity of this. This is important because it doesn't just mean faster internet, but what it gives rise to is high bandwidth application usage like virtual reality, which is Icelanders are some of in the forefront of that. We haven't fully announced it yet, but Facebook just gave a major grant to us and to our organization, Protecting the Park. We'll be launching what will be the highest resolution 3D VR in the world from 23 different locations in what we hope to be the national park, which is really exciting. Steinar and Mumi and his team all helped put that together, and Facebook really came through with these massive Zuckerberg cameras that they brought out here in the summer. And so we're looking at that footage now, but it's really going to be fascinating to see this this virtual reality tour of these, very pristine and almost unattainable places for regular tourists. And then, of course, the main idea of this talk is to look at the brand of Iceland from a standpoint of nature. As I said earlier, 86% of the tourists here come for nature. It's fascinating to come into a new society and talk with people of all different roles in life and society. And very few people, I think, Icelanders understand how important nature is and how much they have to catch up in some respects with the rest of the world's thought of Iceland, right? I think a lot of people here take the nature for granted. And there are lots of different uses for this nature, as we've learned. Steinar and his group went around the country over the last 2 years, talking to different municipalities, asking them about the usages of these lands. And that's all interesting. There's a lot of sheep, there's a lot of jeeping, there's hiking. But what's most important about the nature is that you see a direct economic relationship with it. And to me, it's the biggest opportunity that Iceland has, not just in tourism, which has become the #1 export business in Iceland very rapidly, going from 400,000 people when we first came here in 2010 to over 2 million people this year, expecting to grow 35% next year, and the growth just continues. But unless we protect this wilderness, and unless we start connecting Icelandic nature and the pristine Icelandic nature to other products of Iceland, nobody goes to the grocery store in America and says, I want Icelandic salmon. They go and they get Norwegian salmon or Alaskan salmon. That's because, and it's anecdotal, but because of the whaling business here, starting as early as 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a boycott on Icelandic products in national supermarkets in America. And there are other kind of anecdotal things that happen in the kind of trade relationship with America and Iceland. But for me, if you have your second largest business, which is fishing, and you're mainly a wholesale product, then the best opportunity you have to go up the value chain is to actually start tying this pristine brand of nature in Iceland with the products that come from here, whether it's land, where it's lamb, whether it's vegetables that are organically geothermally greenhouse grown, whether it is the fish. I would love to see the idea of Icelandic blank being considered the most pristine, pure in the world. Entrepreneurs have already started with water, right? But there's a massive opportunity to start taking all of the things we mentioned, whether they are the culture, whether they are products, whether they are skincare products or anti-inflammatory products that come from the ocean. All of these can be put under this umbrella brand of Iceland. When I ran the brand of Disney for 4 years, it was an unbelievable experience. And a lot of times I make the mistake, I think, too much of equating Iceland to a theme park. But there's a lot you can learn from it. It's called at Disney we called it the 360 experience, right? It's the idea that a person comes in the door and they're learning about the stories and the mythology and the things that make the theme park interesting. We have that opportunity here because we now have platforms like social media to tell these stories. And so if you also look at the sustainability, Iceland is the only country in the world that doesn't burn any fossil fuels for energy, right? We have excess of energy, so energy is the third largest import. And what we use that energy for is aluminum smelting and silica production. And everybody villainizes that to an extent. But there's also new opportunities to do data hosting and Bitcoin mining and marijuana farming and all these other ideas that are high water, high energy usages, but we are ideal in this country for it, with the most pristine water sources and really these sustainable energy sources. And so as part of that, I guess 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we were out talking to a bunch of people in America about it, and we got a grant from the Annenberg Foundation, which helped us then get behind a group of people working around consolidating the idea of all of these different groups in Iceland about preserving the national park. And we think that the most important thing that Iceland could do at this moment in time is to build this national park, to preserve it, because you can't make any other rational argument against Icelandic citizens not preserving the one thing that is both the fastest growing and I think the biggest opportunity for both the society and for the economy here. And so hopefully all of you can join the petition. It's on Facebook. It's the Howlandith. It's just facebook.com/protect the park, I think or Iceland's National Park. It's very easy to find. You can type in a bunch of different things. And hopefully you can join that and follow the journey that we have. We've made unbelievable progress in doing this campaign because we want this to be a national resource, right? One of the most interesting things in working with the constitutional reform here has been that the citizens valued the nature and the products that come from nature as a human resource here, as a collective resource. And so we think that all Icelandic citizens understand this value. And now it's no longer about arguing about it, it's now how do we take action to take it to the next step, to build a sustainable national park, and to build sustainable tourism at every level, right? I think we all have woken up to the idea that tourists are not going away, they're only coming stronger, especially looking at social media data. Yesterday I went into Facebook, and over the last 6 months, 34 million people have mentioned the word Iceland in their Facebook feed. So it's only going to be more people coming, right? Because it's on the top of everyone's bucket list. Yesterday, Google announced that the #1 search or aspirational place in the world to come is Iceland, based on search results. So the flood of tourism is coming. There's world attention. There's a captivated audience of Iceland. There's a captured audience in tourism. And it's our responsibility in Iceland to protect these lands, but also to take advantage of the amazing, unique things that Iceland has to offer and boost them all up together simultaneously. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I think we have time for one question for Oliver. Anyone has anything burning? Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Quick question on exporting Icelandic
Yeah.
brand things out. How do you feel about the exportation of clean Icelandic energy through a pipeline?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's a hotly debated topic here because there are no power lines to and from the island. And I think it's about a $3 billion project maybe to try to export energy. I look at it as Iceland is almost this perfectly sustainable place, and I don't like the idea that we would export energy to other places. Economically, it's probably a really good idea, but I think that there are uses of energy, especially in data hosting and in things that are kind of low impact to the environment. The problem is that the second that you do a power line across the ocean, you're at the mercy of other energy prices around the world, and we've already seen that in smelting. Right now the Middle East is undermining the price of smelting here almost by 2x, and so you really become at the mercy when you build a lot of this capacity of energy production and destroy a lot of this nature, And then suddenly you're at the mercy of these giant swings in energy prices. And I think you do a lot better job when you go up the food chain and you offer things like data hosting and Bitcoin mining, other things on top of it, and build it for yourself as opposed to exporting a raw material. It's the same with fish. The majority of fish in this country goes out wholesale, right? Literally, it goes, the fish gets packed in ice, it gets shipped to Keflavik, maybe it's processed one time there, and then it's shipped off, and all the value of it, these new, Mefister, this line to table kind of concepts, those are all being extracted out of Iceland by other countries and other companies. And so it's, once you get a brand of Iceland that's strong and you can start marketing it, then you can go up the value chain in any business that you're talking about by associating a brand of Iceland with that product. And so energy, unfortunately, is a commodity at the most commodity level. And no matter how pristine and excellent Iceland's brand is, I don't think it's ever going to raise the price of energy or have someone pay more for it. So I don't like the idea of a power line.
All right, I think we should thank all of the speakers for wonderful talks.